Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. As we approach spring, finally, we're continuing on our journey to discuss what we call interfaith prophets and prophecy. And what we had decided to do is, and Rabbi came up with the idea, let's start. We had given the introduction last month, but let's start with a prophet we don't speak about much, and that's the last prophet of the Old Testament, or what I call the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, and the last prophet of the prophetic tradition, and this is Malachi. So we're going to, Dottie is going to kind of give us a background and his understanding of Malachi, and then to keep it kind of on the interfaith level, I'm going to jump in and see how the Christian tradition took part of what Malachi said and began to bring it to fruition. So, I mean, it's not a complete answer. It's part of the journey that we're on. And of course, my interpretation is backed up by some. Others would not agree with me. I may throw in a couple of, if we have time, a couple of, what would you say, different ideas at the end, but probably I would have been burned at the stake if I had brought them up in the Middle Ages, but hopefully here I won't be. But welcome, and Rabbi Gotti is about to take us on the journey.
Okay, so our journey begins really to understand Malachi, which was the last prophet in the Hebrew Bible, as Don indicated, to really understand his last words, basically the last prophecy, which happened during the Second Temple, and just as they were building the Second Temple. We have to look at for a minute into the beginning, and the beginning of Jewish prophecy.
What should place it? What was the date of the beginning of the Second Temple? When was the second?
So it was the destruction of the first temple was 586 BCE. And then 70 years later, they were coming back to build the Second Temple. So that's the time of Nehemiah and Ezra and Nehemiah, who came back from Babylonia to build the Second Temple. So this is about the same time. And the Second Temple period, as opposed to the first Temple period, lacked really two things. One was the Ark of the Covenant and the prophecy. So the which really go together, because the oracle, so to speak, came from the high priest, who entered the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur. And once the Ark of the Covenant was not there, in a sense, that oracle was not transmitting, didn't have the Wi-Fi, connection. So really went by teaching more than prophecy. So, but that goes along with the idea that that Judaism really during Second Temple, and then definitely after the destruction of the Second Temple, moved from Temple Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism. So it's more like the teaching of the Bible rather than some prophecy that came on a regular basis. But so going back to the beginning of the conversation that God had with Abraham, the first Jew to walk the face of the earth, God tells Abraham that he will reward him with two things. if Abraham follows God's directions, God's word, he'll reward him with two things. And these two things are always, and they continue with our other forefathers and mothers, is the land and children. So these are the two things that God shows the love to the people of Israel, and vice versa. If they betray God with idols, God exiles them from the land and kills the children. So these are the two components. The book of Malachi begins by those verses, a pronouncement, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. So again, this is like the end. We have Abraham in the beginning and Malachi at the end. And the second verse says, I have shown you love, said the Lord, but you ask, how have you shown me love? After all, declares the Lord, Esau is Jacob's brother, yet I have accepted Jacob. So what does that mean? That God assures the people of Israel that he still loves them. So we need to see something about either the land or the children, right? So Rashi, one of our main commentators, say that when Israel asked God, how have you shown us love? It means the land. So God answers, I gave you, or I gave him the land. So, and the next verse clarifies this. It says, and have rejected Esau. I have made his hills a desolation, his territory a home for beasts of the desert. So again, it goes to the land to show I love Jacob. It means that he has good land and he's dwelling on the land. And Esau has desert, the desolation. So Malachi connects us directly from the beginning, kind of a summary of the relationship between God and the people of Israel. What is different here is that Malachi and many of the prophets do that, but definitely, since we're talking about Malachi now, and he's kind of the last word before we get to the New Testament 500 years later, 450 years later, is kind of put us on the trajectory that, yes, Israel has special treatment. It's the chosen people. And again, chosen, I keep always mentioning this, chosen is not a good translation from the Hebrew word. Am segula, it means that there's something special about this nation that God designates them. So the designated people is a much better word than chosen people, because they're designated for something, not just to be elevated. So, but what we want to see with the last prophecy, we want to see a few things. First, that Israel did have special relationship with God. So we do see that through the land and what God is telling, and we'll read more verses that indicate that. But also that Israel can't just abuse their special treatment, or their special, not special treatment actually, their special status with God. Because if that's the case, then there's no justice in the world, right? If you see somebody in a classroom or in any group that, even though you know they're smarter, maybe they're more talented in some ways, they're the teacher's favorite, still they are not above the law. And God's law, and God keeps telling us that his law is for everybody, is equal for everybody, because otherwise there's no justice in the world. So we have to see somehow that God exacts justice. And the way he says it, that don't think that because you are, in a sense, the designated people, you can do whatever you want. Where is the relationship with God is being practiced between people and God? It's always on the altar. It's not just on the altar, of course. I mean, ultimately, it's how we treat each other. That's the best aroma that God loves, that how we treat the poor, the widow, and so forth. But in terms of the ritual, the relationship between us and God is on the altar. And God keeps emphasizing that the altar has to be pure. So what does that mean for the altar to be pure, for the relationship to be pure? That we can't sacrifice a blemished animal, or the restricted animals, or to sacrifice, to make dealings. If a certain sacrifice is more, it is more beneficial to the priests, because let's say a bull is more expensive, and you can use the skin, and it's more beneficial for the person who makes a sacrifice. Then you should prefer that if a wealthy person brought it, rather than a poor person bringing a pigeon. So that really is where God gets angry at the people of Israel, when they start making those wrong decisions about unjust decisions in the sacrifices. I'm jumping now to the end of Malachi, where I think we would like to kind of start the interfaith prophecy, because Malachi, in a sense, is the bridge between the last word in Israel and the first word in the New Testament. What's the word? What's the difference? The transition is one of the main transitions, is that in the Hebrew Bible, it speaks to Jews, right? And the New Testament brings it to the nations and makes it more universal, or Catholic in that sense. It brings it to the nation. So at the end of days, Malachi almost sets us on that trajectory, that at the end of days, it won't be about if you're Jewish, you're Gentile, you sacrifice, you believe in, definitely you should be believing in one God and in the Creator. But more than that, it depends on what you stand for. So if you believe in God or you don't believe in God, are you an honest person or you're not an honest person? It's problematic for Jewish practice, because what it means is, I'll give you one example, at least from the New Testament, when Jesus said, you care more about what comes into your mouth than what goes out of your mouth, meaning you are very particular about the ritual of eating kosher, but you don't care what comes out of your mouth and who you are bad-mouthing. That doesn't mean necessarily for a Jewish ear that Jesus said, stop eating kosher. It means that you're just putting too much emphasis on that. But in the time of Jesus, in the first century, and even before that, if we go a century or two before, there were the Essenes who already left Jerusalem and went to the desert and created their own communities of purity. They wanted to bring back purity to the ritual, to the relationship with God. They were monastic for the most part. They were communities of men, and they wrote what we discovered as the Dead Sea Scrolls, that really validate the Bible that is written the same for 2,200 years at least. but their main focus, and they were priests who left Jerusalem in the 2nd century BCE. So about 100 or 200 years before the destruction of the temple, the second temple. They wrote about the children of light and children of darkness, meaning that at the end, it won't be necessarily about the ritual, because they saw that the ritual in the temple was dishonest. So it doesn't matter how many animals and expensive animals you put on the altar. If it doesn't come with the right mindset, with the right purity, then it doesn't mean anything. So they were working on that part. And Malachi, at the end of his prophecy, goes to that point. So it almost puts it in the trajectory of when John the Baptist picks up, again, at the desert, probably not that far, not probably, I know the territory, I just came back from that territory, not that far from where the Essenes were, and the Qumran community. He said, so just to look at the first few last verses, he said, in terms of the light and darkness, this was always the allegories that have been used forever. As you know, or we've been discussing that the Jewish practice is all about spreading light. So the Ark of the Covenant, even the word for the Ark of the Covenant is Aron, which means the container of light. And the way we spread the teaching is like light. So you have to have that idea of light and darkness. And light means enlightened. People who have information, they know, but not just information, they have connection with God. They are aware of God. That's the enlightened people in this in this example. And if you're dark, it means that you don't know and you don't adhere to the word of God, and you don't acknowledge God's presence. So what Malachi says at the end, literally he makes a line and said, and you shall come to see the difference between the righteous and the wicked, between him who has served God and him who has not served him. And then he continues and said, for lo, that day is at hand. So he's indicating that there will be a day. So God's judgment is going to come. There'll be a process. God's going to give us clues that something is coming. And, we have to be able to read the signs of the time. But at the end, there will be one day that something will happen. Unfortunately, those days can be, like an earthquake. And unfortunately, what happened in Turkey and Syria happened the day we landed in Israel. That was terrible. But I'm not connecting necessarily that, but I'm saying that God will indicate in one day something that will happen that separate the righteous and those who are not. And he said that day is at hand, burning like an oven. All the arrogant and all the doers of evil shall be straw. And the day that is coming, said the Lord of hosts, shall burn them to ashes, and leave of them neither stock nor bows. And then he said, but for you who revere my name, a son of victory shall rise to bring healing. You shall go forth and stamp like stall-fed cows. So there'll be that darkness and light. And how would that manifest itself? Be mindful of the teaching of my servant Moses, whom I charged at Horeb. Horeb is Mount Sinai, with laws and rules for all Israel, which means that this Shabbat, yesterday, we read the parasha, the portion of Mishpatim, of the judgments and the ordinances that talk about how to deal with each other. It preceded or followed the Ten Commandments, that big ideas. But then, how do we treat each other? If my ox gores your ox, what do we do? If it goes down to those little details, that if my ox gored for the first time, how much you pay? If my ox is a goring ox, and we already knew that there's danger in it, I have to pay a different amount, or I have to be people have to be put to death because they weren't careful. So that's really what the progress of Malachi, bringing the word of God from specifically to the people of Israel, but then to general people who are righteous and people who are not, people who are in the light and people who are in the darkness. And then finally, which then definitely connects to the New Testament, he said, be mindful of the teaching of, that's what we said, of my servant Moses, whom I charged at Horeb with laws and rules for all Israel. And then, lo, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful of the day of the Lord. So again, the fearful day. Something will happen. There will be a day that something will happen that it will be no doubt who's on which side. Before I finish it with the last verse, I really think that there's something about the time that we live today, that everything is documented and everything is online, and you really can't avoid being exposed. So if you lied or if you did something, it's then for everybody to see. So that day, maybe, I don't know, something will happen that maybe certain leaders will be exposed, and it happens all the time, that process. But maybe there will be one day that a report will come out and with evidence and something that was recorded and on Facebook, and there will be no doubt about something that really transpired. And then he said, what will Elijah do? And this is the first time that he mentioned, the prophet that will return. And as we know, Elijah was the only prophet that we know for sure that didn't die, that went up to heaven with his full body. He went up to heaven, so we are awaiting for him. So in the Jewish tradition, Elijah is someone that we wait for all the time. So we leave a seat for him at the Seder. He even gets a glass of wine. He comes to every circumcision, the covenant of circumcision. So Elijah is part of our ritual all the time. So Elijah will come back. As he went up with his body, he will come down with his body. And of course, this is a link to the New Testament of Jesus' assumption to heaven and returning. But he will return with a harbinger, and the harbinger will be Elijah, who will come and prepare the way for the king. So the king never arrives. So either you're either Christian or Jewish, and you you're waiting for a Messiah who is a king. Either way, you have to prepare the way for a king. The king doesn't prepare the way for himself. You have to pave the way. So how will the way be paved in that sense? It says he shall reconcile parents with children and children with their parents. So that when I come, he said, when God returns or comes, when I come, I do not strike the whole land with utter destruction. So these are the last words of Malachi. We tend to read the line before because we don't want to end the whole Bible with this line. So we tend to repeat the line before. We say, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of the Lord. But really, technically, the last words of Malachi is he shall reconcile, meaning Elijah will reconcile parents with children and children with their parents. So before I give it back to Don, this is what we see as paving the way to the king, or really bringing redemption. Because this is what it's about. Being redemption is, and literally the words in Hebrew is to return the hearts of the parents onto their children and the hearts of the children onto their parents. So ultimately, if parents and children get along at home, this is the first indication that the world has, in a sense, hope, because any relationship between people and justice starts at home. Like charity starts at home, justice starts at home. So if parents and children would align on that topic, and lastly, they would have to be aligned about the presence of God and the relationship and the presence, of course, of God. So this is kind of what Malachi sets the stage for. He really kind of summarizes pretty much all the previous prophets that came before him that kept telling us it's not about the technicality of your practice. It really is about keeping yourself as an altar and the altar of God pure, starting from the heart.
It's going to be my job now to take what Malachi is saying. And remember now, Malachi is, for Christians, the last book of the Old Testament. It's the last book of the prophetic tradition in Judaism. Right? So I am going to, and my translation, Gotti is using the Hebrew Bible translation. I'm using the Greek, or the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. The ideas are relatively the same, wording is different. But in the book of Malachi, it's very interesting. You can see as a prophet, we know that prophets speak for God. Right? They are a special breed. They are called to speak for God. What Malachi does, interestingly enough, he sets up his book where the first 3 chapters, the prophet does what the prophet is supposed to do. The prophet just doesn't foretell the future. What the prophet does is the prophet looks at the present time. He looks at the signs of the times in relationship to God. The prophet has a special relationship with God, and he looks at the times in relationship to that God. And he reads the signs of the times, and basically he says, and this is where the kind of foretelling comes in, if you continue to do this, that, or the other thing, then this will happen. So what Malachi does in his book, first 3 chapters are made up of what we call oracles. There were 6 oracles. And he looks at the present time, what's going on, the discontent of the people, the unpure or the impure offerings they're making, and so on and so forth. And he's looking at the present time. In the last chapter, though, he moves from the present time to the future time, what we might call eschatological, something that's going to happen at the end, right? Referred to as the day of judgment that Scotty was just talking about. So see if you can follow me now as I try to bring all of this into a more Christian consciousness, which follows through and therefore leads into the New Testament, the Gospels. Okay? It's interesting because we have to remember that we're primarily talking here about the Gospel. The writings of St. Paul took place well before the Gospels were written. So Paul's writings are pretty much the first writings of what we call the New Testament. He started writing in about 4950 AD or CE, and then writes up to the time of his death, which is around 67. But we're talking here about the lead into the Gospels to the Jesus story. How did the Christian community now, in their understanding, take what they're saying, what Malachi was saying, and bring it to an understanding of Jesus? So again, to repeat, in the last section of the last chapter, there are the 2 elements that God brought up. He says, remember the teaching of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. And then he says, lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse. So the oracles deal basically with present. Chapter 4 turns to the future, to the eschatological age. Okay? And he makes the difference between evildoers who will be destroyed and the righteous who will rejoice. Okay? Now, you ask a question. Does this provide us with hope or promises? And what the Christian would say is that Malachi is ending with a message of hope and promises. There's that looking forward to in the future, something that's coming. And so we end with the idea of hope and promises. This becomes, now, this is not just for Christianity, because don't forget, Judaism continues its religion, its covenant with God. And the other thing that we have to remember here, and it's part of Catholic teaching, especially out of Vatican II, God does not forsake his covenant with the Jews. He does not forsake his covenant with the Jews. The New Testament covenant does not take over for the Jewish covenant. And that teaching has been around for a long time, and Vatican II pretty much said, no, God is faithful to the Jews when he calls them the chosen people. We understand the idea of chosen people to mean that, and it's a paradox, they are the smallest and weakest of peoples in their time and place, but they are the ones who are called to witness to the one God. That's what makes them chosen. It's not a moral choosing, but it's a choosing of designation to witness to the world the one God. That's why they're chosen, because they're the smallest. If they were the most powerful, okay, people would say, well, look, they've got all of this power. Why not? Will be
They
the
coerce.
greatest, right? They were the smallest. So that in witnessing God, what does that mean? It means that even though they are a small group, the actions of God will be seen through them because they are weak. I would contend, as part of the message of the New Testament, the power of Jesus lies in his powerlessness. Okay. Again, the great paradox of Christianity. And Christianity is a religion of paradox. Okay. So at the end, right, the conclusion is formed according to the fidelity of God and is congruent with the conclusion of the Torah. See, the Torah ends, interestingly enough, the end of Deuteronomy. It calls upon Moses, and Moses is the symbol of the Torah. He is the lawgiver. But Moses is not permitted to enter the Holy Land. And so what God is saying to Moses as he ends the Torah is that there is hope, that there is a promise that I give you that you will inherit the land and so on.
Now, I just want to interject for a minute here. Every year when we go on the trip to Israel, there's a spot that we go to. It's called the baptismal site, where John the Baptist, who basically is the character that is equivalent to Elijah here, and Don, we will talk about it, that's the one spot that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. It's the same spot as the Israelites coming through into the land, and it's the same spot that Elijah go up to heaven. So it's that one spot of transition. So Moses was actually held at that spot. He wasn't able to cross the Jordan River at that spot, pretty much. And then Elijah go up to heaven at that spot, and transition from the earthly to the heavenly. And then also John the Baptist baptized Jesus, meaning again brings it back from heavenly to earthly, or actually I would say maybe from earthly to heavenly again. So that is a transition point from earthly to heavenly at one spot.
And if you saw the spot today, you'd start laughing because you could, I don't know, it's what, 15 feet wide?
Yeah, you
20
can
feet
just cross
wide.
it
You
very
could probably
easily.
walk across. It's not the mighty Jordan that we picture, but it's more the symbolism that he was talking about. So what we begin to see that in this conclusion, all right, that's added on, the last two verses, Moses as the sign of the law is spoken of. And verse 4 talks about Moses. Verse 5 of chapter 4 focuses on Elijah and therefore the prophetic tradition. So the book of Malachi really ends with an emphasis on the law and the prophets. And that statement is used in the New Testament to designate what Christians would call the whole Old Testament, all right, the whole law. And what he's saying is the hope of Elijah coming and the law being fulfilled is still part of a promise. It's still not fulfilled, which then the Christian community kind of takes as its beginning. So what kind of parallels can we make? Well, first of all, there are three observations that Christians can make about this. The text of Malachi, the last couple of verses, concludes the latter prophets, what the Jews call the latter prophets. We call them minor prophets. But it also ends for Christians the whole Old Testament. So what the Christian ends up doing, the Old Testament ends in a prophetic idea of hope. And it was easy then for the Christians to tie into that, to relate it to the life of Jesus. And the fact that somehow John the Baptist is linked to Elijah. And we see that in the Gospel of Mark especially. As is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my message ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. John appeared in the wilderness proclaiming the baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And the people from the whole of the Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him. Let's see. He proclaimed, the one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandal. I have baptized you with water, and he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. There's the indication that John is the predecessor of someone greater than himself. To tie in to Elijah as the one who will come before the Messiah does.
Yeah, now also the John the Baptist was the son of Zechariah, who was the high priest in the temple. So it moves just like the movement of Judaism would move eventually from the temple centered to the teaching. That's what he does. He comes out of the temple. He goes to the desert. That is also symbolic because the people of Israel received the Torah in the desert, where it doesn't belong to anybody specifically. So it is that movement from a specific time and place to something more, esoteric, I would say. So it is it's the same kind of movement, and I hope we're able to kind of transmit that idea that spot, the people, what Malachi is saying, don't focus on the temple, don't make the temple an idol. You have to come out of the temple to understand really what the meaning of the temple. So, I mean, as a rabbi today, when I hear what Jesus said back then, I would say, I could hear myself saying stuff like that. On the rabbinic level, basically what the whole idea, because he was reflecting what Malachi was saying and other prophets, it's that we have forgotten the spirit of things, that we get more technical and we forget the heart of things. So this is the idea of, I will bring you a new heart, I will baptize you with the Spirit, and sort of bringing it from earthly to heavenly.
It follows through what the prophet Jeremiah says in the 31st chapter. I will create a new covenant and give you a clean heart, and so on and so forth. The second way that Christians have taken up from Malachi and projected it onto the Jesus movement. And the other thing I wanted to say in terms of the Jesus movement, followers in what we read in the Gospels is really the story of a family feud. All right? Don't forget, in the Gospels, there are no Christians. Jesus never met a Christian. He didn't know what a Christian was. All right. What we're dealing with in the Gospels is who will the people choose to follow in terms of the leader who will inspire them to live out the Torah. Okay. So you have, on the Jewish side, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and on the other side, you have what the early Christians would call the people of the way. Okay. They weren't called Christian until about 20 years after Jesus died. They were known as the people of the West. It was a family feud, right? There are no Christians in the gospel.
Yeah, and fulfilling the full word of God has to come, as we said, with the heart, right? You can't just go with the motion. And I think that's why at the end, when it says, bringing back the hearts of the parents onto the children, the hearts of the children onto the parents, is the emphasis on the heart. That you can't fake that. Children and are very perceptive, and they know where the hearts of the parents are, and where if a parent goes to the church just to sit there and to say, check, I've taken my children to synagogue or to church, or they really are into it, and they pray and they're faithful. So I mean, on our pilgrimage, I can always say, I mean, I love the people who go with me, and I think it's beneficial for everybody who goes to the Holy Land. As Father Roy said, it's the fifth gospel. You learn something you can't learn from the four gospels. But you can see there are people who just want to be there in the holy sites. They want to follow where Jesus was and where the Bible happened. But some people really are faithful in it. And when they pray in those holy sites, they really are connecting to the spirit of the place. So this is really the conversation.
And as a religious educator, I can tell you that we reach a crisis when we look at religion, parents, and children, because we know existentially that we see parents dropping off their kids to church, okay? And then the parents going home. There's no nurturing going on between children and parents. And what's happening is, unless that nurturing takes place, unless there is a connection of hearts, if you will, between the children and parents, when it comes to their understanding of God, it's not going to be do as I say, not as I do, right? This idea of the children choosing religions for themselves when they grow older, what basis do they have? They're going to deal and do what their parents have done, right? And so what then becomes the basis for their choosing? So anyway, that's what the heart of bringing children and parents back together, that importance. So the second conclusion that Christians came to, or the Gospels come to, is that this promise of Malachi is taken up in the Gospel of Luke. And it's where John the Baptist and Elijah are connected. The reading is, he will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. With the spirit of the power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of righteousness, make ready a people prepared for the Lord. That's Luke. Already we're hearing the word, same word of children and parents and their relationship. So the expectation is that the idea of Elijah permeates the gospel, that idea of his return. And the whole Christian community now intentionally connects Jesus and the Jesus movement to this tradition. So they're making the tradition. Finally, there's another event that takes place in the New Testament where this idea of connecting comes up. And that's the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus goes up the mountain, he is transfigured, and in this moment of transfiguration, there stands beside Jesus Moses and Elijah. And what the Christian community then sees here, obviously, is the connection with Moses and the law, the connection with Elijah, the prophets, in other words, the whole Old Testament, as Christians would see it, tied up with Jesus. And what the idea is, the implication is that Jesus is now the fulfillment of that promise. So here's where I see a possible controversy. Christians understand that there was only one conclusion or one end to that line of promise, and that was Jesus. And they would say that was the end of the revelation of God. God spoke through his son, got nothing more to say. But as I'm thinking through this, when God makes a promise, and he's made a promise to the Jews, as we saw at the end of Malachi, because the promise and the expectations are also continuing for the Jews. The Jews are taking another way to fulfilling those promises. And what I would say too, we're not going to confine God to our particular faith tradition. If there's anything we know about God, right, you put God in a box, and every box we build for God is too small. If God sets down promises and hope, it would seem to me that yes, Christianity is one of the answers to the fulfillment of that hope. And Christians make a decision to follow that way. Don't forget what I said, the early Christians were called the people of the way. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Christians have committed in faith a decision to follow that way. Jews have made a commitment to continue to follow in the tradition of the rabbis, right, to whatever that promise leads to. But I would also say, if that holds true for Jews and Christians, who's to say who else God is talking to and making these promises for? There's an openness that has to come from this. Christianity is one way, Judaism is another way, Islam is another way. We're not going to put God in a particular box. He's still true to his promises. All right? He's going to fulfill those promises, and whichever tradition you choose to belong to, you're going to read the world. You're going to read the signs of the times in light of your belief. I used to tell my students, there is no difference between the goal of religion and the goal of science. The goal of both of them is to give an interpretation of reality. Science interprets reality by measurement or through measurement. Religion, and now let's speak of Christianity. The religion of Christianity interprets reality through the mirror, through the filter of belief in the risen Jesus. But there's no contradiction. There should be no contradiction between science and religion. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's a simple example. But you take death. How is death interpreted? It's interpreted, how is it measured in science? Well, pulse, brain waves, even the old way of putting a mirror up to somebody's nose. Death, that's how death is interpreted. For a Christian can easily accept the scientific answer, but the interpretation of death for a Christian is that death is the passage from one life of existence to another life of existence. So, there should be no contradiction between the two. And that's the way the early Christians, at least, began to see Jesus as being depicted in light of Elijah and Moses. But as far as I'm concerned, yes, I choose to be a Christian as a Catholic, and I take Jesus as the one who comes as the Son of God, whom I am to imitate. We talked about this the other day. Jesus didn't come to die. If God sends Jesus to die, I would call God a child abuser. A supernatural child abuser. Sending the son to die, right? All right, as the Italians would say, uffa. All right. So what we're doing here is we're trying to look at the whole of the life of Christ as it leads to his death. And that's what we choose. Christians choose to live their life and interpret reality through the filter of the resurrection. Jews filter or interpret reality, I would presume, through the teachings of the Torah and the rabbis. So again, the religions that we belong to should be a personal choice. And once we make the personal choice, we commit ourselves to interpreting the way things are through the filter of that person we put our faith in.
My conclusion will be, thank you, and I would say that as we talk about the purpose of designation of Israel as a witness in this world, for every important witnessing, you need two. So the way to kind of bring this together, the last lines of Malachi, is that we have to agree on something. And even if you see Judaism and Christianity as a parent-child, the heart of the children and the parents should align, not necessarily that they will end up believing in the same thing, because we won't. But we have to believe about the heart. This is why it's going to the heart. The two witnesses and the heart, that there's something about whether you're Christian or you're Jewish, you have to understand that the heart has to be pure. And that really, I think, is the key of Malachi. That idea of Elijah. Why is Elijah coming back? Because Elijah was able to be pure in his life, and God took him as is. So he's an example of that purity on the altar. His last mission was to fight with the priest of the Baal, of the idol worshipers on the Carmel. And they were not able to do what he did because he was pure. So I think it's not about understanding everything or agreeing on everything. And these are the last words of Malachi. It's about agreeing on something. And that something is that the purity of heart.
And the other thing to remember is sometimes when we in our age hear the word purity, we start thinking about morality, sexual morality, and things like that. That's a totally different meaning. This idea of purity permeates the whole person and the relationship between the person and God.
Yeah, I mean, if you give charity, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, it doesn't matter. But when you give $1, it doesn't matter. You can give $1, you can give $100,000. When you give that $1, did you give it with a full heart? That is where we have to agree on. And that's what Malachi is basically saying. The hearts have to return to each other. That alignment has to happen, because that really is the most important alignment that this world has to offer. And the three characters that Don mentioned, that the Transfiguration Church on Mount Tabor is Elijah, Jesus in the middle, and then Elijah and Moses, because they are the three persons, according to our individual traditions, that we're whole, that we're able to complete that spiritual cycle, to be humble enough to be complete in their heart and move to the next, from the earthly as is to the heavenly.
And that's why in Christianity, the constitution of Christianity we find in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. And the whole key to our daily living is in Matthew 25. As long as you did it for one of these, the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. So Christianity from a moral, existential point of view is the balance and living out the Beatitude and Matthew 25. As long as you do it, because through the whole Old Testament and the New Testament, one of the things that is absolutely clear is that God has a preferential option for the poor. I know we have a lot of people who refuse to see that, especially today when you have these ministers on television basically preaching a gospel of prosperity. And you see in the spirit of the scriptures that God has this preferential option for the poor. How do you balance that? So we leave it at that till next month on the 19th of March, where we will continue. We haven't decided which prophet yet, but
Yeah, no, we thought to just go back in reverse order. But maybe we do have a couple of minutes for questions, and the microphone is coming around.
Did Elijah return?
We still believe that he has not. He will, and when he comes back, we'll know that he is, the process of the messianic time that begun.
no, because Elijah is a person of Judaism.
In the
He's
Christian,
not just a symbol, he's the reality.
okay.
So
I thought it was mentioned in the New Testament that John the Baptist represented.
but he was not Elijah. They asked him,
Yeah,
is this Elijah? I said, no. John the Baptist was John the Baptist. He wasn't somebody, dressed up like Elijah or, no.
Oh, so you're saying that John the Baptist
Is Elijah.
is per se Elijah,
that is
From-
an
according to the
interpretation.
Christian belief.
No,
I would say no. We'll do
Thank
the
you,
best we
everybody,
can.
for coming
Thank you
and
for
spending
coming.
the time, your afternoon here with us.